So there is one problem that we haven't yet discussed in finding the roots of polynomials that you may have discovered if you made a copying mistake in the process of working one of those factoring problems. And that is, sometimes it just fails. For example, consider this polynomial. It only has two possible rational roots. Leading coefficient is 1. Constant is -1. The only possible rational roots are 1 or -1. And it's easy to see that neither one of those is a root. With this polynomial and these numbers, it's easier to just plug in directly rather than bother with synthetic division. If I plug in x equals 1, I'll have 1 to the 5th minus 3 times 1 squared minus 1, which works out to -3. If I plug in x equals -1, I'll have -1 to the 5th minus 3 times -1 squared minus 1, which works out to -5. And neither one of these is 0. So these are not roots. On the other hand, if we analyze the signs, we see that this polynomial has one sign change right here. So it has one positive root. If we substitute -x, well, the only term with an odd power of x is this first one, which has no sign changes. So we have no negative roots. This polynomial has one root. It must have, well, it's degree 5. 1 is real. It must have 4 imaginary roots. We're only going to be concerned with the real root here. And if we have a computer-generated graph of the polynomial for us, we see something that certainly looks like a 0. It looks like the graph passes through the x-axis at that point there. In other words, it looks like this polynomial has a 0 somewhere between 1 and 2. But how do we know that that's real? The way the computer draws this graph is by plotting lots of tiny little points and connecting them, just the same way that we would if we wanted to draw a graph without knowing anything else about the function, except the computer does it 100 times in that little space. How do we know that the computer is justified in connecting those dots? In other words, how do we know that there's really a 0 there? And then once we know that there really is a 0 there, we'll also ask, how can we find out what it is? But the big thing that we need to know is, there's really a 0 there. And that's what we're going to talk about next. How do we know that there's really a 0? And once we know that there's really a 0, we'll talk about how to find out what it is.